Hi, I want to talk about two metaphors for communication, how I think communication works. The first I want to talk about is multimodal communication. All right, now with multimodal communication, it works like this. Basically, words have multiple modes. Each mode is like you can think of it as in a dictionary, right? There would be five definitions for a word. Each one of those is a different mode of that word. And when someone speaks a word just alone, with no context, they could mean any of those modes. So all the modes are up there. But when you put it with other words, and the word occurs in a context, a situation in the world, um, then some of those modes can't really pertain. So, for example, with the word like thing, it really is a tool, a special word that has infinite modes. It can mean anything, but it can mean something particular, right? And it does. We often use that. If I call my cousin up and say, hey, bring that thing I bought you tomorrow, thing has a very particular meaning, and he'll know what that is because of the context of the situation. So when a person says a word, they're using all these modes. When they put it with other words, then some of those modes get masked out, right? Because of the context. Other words in that sentence give a context where only certain modes are going to be applied. Let's say you have, 10 words with five modes each. Then by using the permutations, then theoretically that sentence could have 10 to the, how would it be? Let's see. 5 to the 10 possible meanings. But because a lot of those possible meanings are masked out because of context, like in that sentence I just gave, thing doesn't have all of its possible meanings. It's being used to refer to something in particular. So there'll be a lot less than 5 to the 10 meanings in that sentence. But it'll be more than one as well. Let's say there's five meanings for that sentence. When you take all the modes, if you assume that this word has this meaning and that masks out a certain way, and then if that word has a different meaning, it masks out a certain way, leaves a process of elimination occurs, which leaves a certain possible definition. If you're speaking very precisely, then theoretically you want there just to be one meaning. But I'd say in general, the sentence that's put out there could have possible meanings. Now, if there's five meanings of that sentence, it could be that the speaker means just one particular one of those meanings is what they have in mind. On the other hand, maybe not. Maybe they're speaking ambiguously because they're thinking ambiguously and they don't really know which of the meanings they're professing. Or maybe they're a poet and they're professing all five of those meanings at once intentionally. And so that takes you up to the creation of the sentence. Then there is a perceiver that's reading that sentence. Now, they understand a different set of modes, right? Not everybody knows every definition for a word, and people can have their own definitions. People can misunderstand what a word means, and maybe even have the same misunderstanding as someone else. And they could communicate using that word in that supposedly wrong definition because they have that definition. And that's what goes on in the perceiver. They look up there and see all the modes, and they match the same patterns, and they derive five meanings. But those five meanings that sentence may have will not be exactly the same five that the other person has. But if they overlap, and there is an overlap, then that overlap is the communication. Okay, and so that's how communication goes. You put up all of these modes in a pattern. Context selects which ones really pertain. The perceiver does the same thing, but in the absorption space. They're absorbing these meanings. They know maybe what definitions you are familiar with the term, and all of these add into the context and mask the meaning differently, and you're trying to get a meaning. Okay, now for those of you that didn't understand that, fine. For those that did, you might see some problems, and if you do see some problems with that metaphor, then comment, tell me, I'm interested. But I myself don't really see communication as merely multimodal. I see it as spectral. Spectral communication is a similar situation, but rather than modes, because you see the problem with the modal thinking is that words don't have that precise a meaning. Each of those modes, or those definitions, also has a blurry space of possible interpretations. And I see that as a patch of color. So to me, a term is like a spectrum. a kind of a rainbow. And there's little blotches of color, and it is discontinuous. There's parts where there's no light, and those are the separations of the various modes. But they're all related through the word in one big spectra, and any given mode is actually a little patch of color with a variance of interpretations to what the word means. So even if a word is understood in a particular mode, there's still a spectrum of interpretations available. And so in this model, the speaker puts the spectra up there. Context masks some of the spectra out, right? So a word all alone with no context has this big spectra. Given the context of the other words and the situation, then you masked out some of that. You have just a subset of the spectra, and the listener has absorption spectra that they're prepared. The modes that they understand of the word is the spectra of the word if they were to speak it, but when they're listening, it's the spectra they're prepared to see. So in your context, they're saying, well, which part of your spectra lights up? They match their spectra to that, and where they overlap, that's where you have communication. If they overlap really well and the spectra are really tight and conform really well to what other people's meanings of the term, then that communication can be very technical and efficient. But in general, it can also be that you have a little patch of orange where they have a little patch of red, and that's close enough for some information to come through, but it's also tweaked a little bit. There's a changing of what is meant to be conveyed because of this process of matching our understandings.